Is it Jenny Jordan signing? I appreciate that.
And we'll stay in touch with that.
Have you used, do you know the app?
I have the app and I'm still haven't been around, and what would be the best use of social media is what I'm looking for. So, you know, as far as putting content out there and what the best avenue would be with it, you know. Text or should I email it, because it's just really you're all right, but you hit and it goes into the ad or whatever.
Yeah, you can post that URL on Facebook.
Okay.
And pin it to the top, it's going to the neighborhood page. And so for all the purveyors in the neighborhood, please click on this. And then we also email it to you.
Okay, and that would just be the URL. I'm sorry. I wasn't quite sure because I used now. That I wasn't real sure about this.
It was just a platform to be able to connect like over to the neighbors.
Okay, okay, sounds good. Yeah, I heard you say something in class about. So
Seems like they're not really. I want yes.
Well, Jim Ellis has proved that security is not working anymore. How's that retirement going? You keep joking about.
Oh, it's going good. I went to the grocery store 3 times. I got my hair trimmed when I did.
But you keep doing deals. People keep coming to you, don't they? And here theoretically, you're kind of. All that. Morning, Nick. How you doing, sir?
Morning, waiting for this company to kick in. I think better kick in within the next 5 minutes. I don't know.
Pardon me? Yeah, please, we do that. That's a good idea. It would be very, very valuable for you to sign in. So we've got documentation of how many people are in this quasi-mandatory risk management class. What happens is when things hit, and hits track looks at our calendar, they look at our training, they look at our sign in, and say, okay, how many of your people were in these classes? So, well, there was 4 there were 3 of them. Well, Bob, you're in trouble. Actually, from a Trek standpoint, the Trek complaint never has my name in Mike's name. Because he's the broker of record. I'm just the managing broker. He's the broker of record. So it's his name on it. So technically, tractor plane is Mike's problem, right? Until he hands it to me, says, Bob, take care of this. Okay, fine, well, we're going to look at it. Now, a lawsuit also has his name on it, but now Rockwall, lawsuits and tractor planes have my name, because I'm the broker of record here, so it works here. But this is great. So, in a few minutes, well, is it 10?
Yes, sir.
Okay, it's 10, it's on the spot. So let's, and don't stand in front of the camera because we got the Zoom folks here. So they're right there behind you. Working through it. Okay. Okay, so, and we've done this before. We need to be more diligent about doing it every year. Our risk management class. We do have seats still up here, so around, grab a. And we're gonna go through and make use of PowerPoint, which is something I rarely use in class, but Barney makes use of it and we put it together.
Yeah.
So while people are still wandering in, signing and so forth, Barney Schwartz is with Assured Partners. What's your role there?
Whatever.
Whatever. Okay. Barney is our insurance agent for our E&O insurance. Every year when we renew, we go through him and he gets quotes and works up our loss run ratios and things like that that help us do it. Whenever we have a demand letter and a lawsuit, I turn in Barney and whichever E&O company we're with that year. We've actually been with the same one for about almost 5 years now, with CNA. And I like that longevity. I like that consistency with, because when we have something that comes up that actually started a couple of years ago or whatever, it's good to be with the same company because there's no question on coverage. So he's got a PowerPoint. He's going to talk about a lot of different things here. I'll kind of interject from time to time because Barney looks at it from the E&O standpoint. I look at it from the broker standpoint and from our standpoint and kind of, emphasize and talk about some of our policies and what we do. Please feel very comfortable asking questions. Because if he touches on something, you go, wow, man, never heard about that before. What's that? Is that new? And well, yeah, we first started about 10 years ago and that's okay. So please, but now, as you have questions or comments, please be focused on what we're talking about. Because it's real easy to get off into something just way different or whatever and not a good situation. What if we have more chairs out there we can bring in? Yeah. So. I'll get it. Thanks, sir. It'll work through it. So any questions before we get started? We run from 10 to 12 as we work through it. We typically, right at 11, we'll take a quick 5-minute break if you run down the hall or whatever, but there's need to step out or something. The only thing I would ask is as a courtesy, don't make phone calls, take phone calls while you're in the class.
Can I?
Yeah, you can. It's not a problem. But other than that, we kind of work, so just feel comfortable. So please welcome Barney Schwartz.
Well, good morning. And so, yes, I do handle the E&O insurance for the office, but I'm also one of Texas Realtors risk management partners. So I go down with them once a year. They've written several articles for Texas Realtor Magazine. The most recent one, I believe, was on when to notify your insurance or your broker of a potential situation. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And was a panelist at the most recent Texas Realtor conference. That was a lot of fun with somebody from Trek and somebody who was an eviction attorney. And I was kind of in the middle, providing the insurance to, when either one of those two served. So hopefully, what you will take out of the class today is the most common types of claims and ways to avoid being sued. Steps to take when selling your own property. There are additional steps to take. I call it dual agent transactions, also known as acting as an intermediary. Dealing with the crazy client. Now, if somebody here says we never deal with crazy clients, I'll stick over that or skip over that part of the class.
We won't skip over it.
All right. And how to protect your email from getting hacked into, because that is a major, major issue within the real estate community. So it's very, very important with E&O is to know who and what is covered. Anybody here have their own LLC? The commissions are paid to the LLC. Okay. As long as Bob and Mike and the office is the broker on your contracts, then they're covered under E&O. But if you're happen to be your own broker and you put your own name on the contract, then it is not covered under this E&O. So that's what triggers it as an independent contractor. The other thing E&O policies do is they specify what occupations are covered. Why do they do that? So you're not insuring a lawyer or a CPA on a real estate E&O policy. And I'll give you an example. Agent goes and lists, and this is a KW office, not in DFW. They list a Jiffy Lube building. Anybody here do commercial? Anybody? Same? Okay. There you go, Scott. So listen in on this. No, I'm joking. So they go and list this building, nice building. As the transaction progresses, the buyer's asking questions about the Jiffy Lube franchise, about the franchise agreement, asking for profit and loss statements, asking about training programs. So, and again, the agent, the realtor is just doing the nice thing and just being the kind of pass through. Here's the information you requested. They're getting it from the seller, seller's agent, sending it to buyer's agent, and you're just passing it over. A lawsuit comes in not on the sale of the commercial building, but on the sale of the business. And the realtor was roped into it because they were acting as the conduit of information. And the E&O company came back and said, sorry, no coverage. You were acting as a business broker and not as a realtor. And the claim wasn't due to the sale of the building. So again, stick to the real estate portion of the sale. Doesn't mean you can't give rent rolls or something like that if you're selling a commercial building. But again, stick to the sale of commercial property. Everybody's heard the term fiduciary duty, right? All of you know more about real estate in the room than I do. I hopefully know more about insurance and risk management than all of you do. That means you have to recommend things to me and I have to recommend things to you. But this is actually a Bob Baker slide who made it very, very clear what's the most important thing to know is as a fiduciary is what not to do. And what you do not do is offer advice outside of real estate. And you do not make decisions for your clients. Anything you'd like to interject? Bob?
Well, and of course, as you know, we have a form, a vendor statement policy form, that when you give information on vendors, title companies, lenders, so forth, it's important that they sign off on that, because where we get into trouble is when there's a problem, for example, with a lender, and they say, well, Bob, you're a lender. And they start talking about our lender, we're in trouble. It needs to be their lender. They need to make the choice. They need to make understand that while they have a right to benefit from our sets of experiences, and they have a right to, what they need to understand is we're not recommending, we're not endorsing. We're not saying, oh yeah, here's a good lender, here's a good title company, here's a good whatever. We can't do that because we then have liability in that. And it's not just a CYA thing, cover your assets. It's bad service to the client. Because what they do is they see us as that safety net to take care of any problems. And they need to understand we can't do that. We're not the safety net. If we've got a problem with the lender or the title company or the contractor, the inspector, that's between them. We can't be put in the middle of that. And when they see us as the one that can really fix that, that's wrong. So we've got to make sure that when we have a conversation, they benefit from your sets of experiences. But at the same time, they understand you're not recommending that. I think it's a problem that if you say, well, I don't recommend anybody, I can't do any of that. And then you say, why don't you just Google it up? Well, that's a problem. Because then when you get somebody really bad, then we've got liability. So they need to go through that process and do this. But we want them to benefit from what we know, but they need to not think we've just endorsed somebody, because we have not. Yes, ma'am, question?
Understand what you meant. You must recommend when appropriate means.
Yeah, when they need something, they need some kind of a service, some kind of whatever. Don't say, well, I have no idea, just Google it up. Recommend something, for example, if they've got a problem, they say, I think we've got foundation problems. So you know what you need to do? You need to get a foundation company or a structural engineer out here. You need to recommend them, that you always send them to someone else. You don't have that expertise. So when something's going on, they've got questions about something, they'll say, wow, that's beyond my authority. I'm sorry, I can't help you. Recommend things, when it's appropriate, do that. Good question. Thank you.
All right. Go. All right, so this is an important slide. What to do when a TREC complaint, a subpoena request, or an E&O claim comes in. And let me kind of walk through the process on this. So the example of a subpoena request is you represent the buyer loves you, you did everything possible for the buyer. But the seller didn't, and the seller and listing agent misrepresented something with the house. So guess what? The buyer wants to go after the seller. It's okay, they don't want to involve you again because you did everything that you were supposed to do. So they go and sue the seller, and now their attorney turns around and goes, oh, but we need some stuff from your file so that we can go and sue the seller. And so you get something called a subpoena request. And that's a legal request to go and produce documents. Now, what you do not do is turn over the documents. What you do is you notify Bob, we notify E&O, and they will pay to have an attorney at no cost review that subpoena request so that you're only sending out the stuff that you have to and not anything that you don't have to. Same thing with a TREC complaint. Do not go and answer a TREC complaint on your own, again, because that can manifest itself into an E&O claim, right? The importance of notifying the office when you get any sort of demand. Let me run through an example with you. You have a demand for a dishwasher. The dishwasher broke. You didn't disclose to me that the dishwasher was broken. And you're like, oh, crud, we're going to fight over a $500 dishwasher. If need be, I'll just cut a check for it. So you don't say anything about the dishwasher. Meanwhile, Bob and I are talking about the E&O renewal, and we go and switch companies. Why? Because Travelers was more competitive this year than CNA, who we've had for the last 5 years. And on the Travelers application, we checked, there are no known claims that have not been reported. But you've gotten a demand letter. Again, it's only a dishwasher. But guess what? That person who's mad about the dishwasher is more likely to find something else in the house to come after you. So now all of a sudden, what was a little dishwasher claim, now there's a plumbing issue under the house, or now there's a foundation issue or something like that. So now you're like, oh, whoa, this is more than just a dishwasher. Let me notify Bob. And so we go and notify the new insurance company because it's a new knowledge, new claim. And they come back and say, oh, sorry, you had a demand for the dishwasher before our policy took effect. So don't mess around with holding these things on your own.
We have, by the way, had that happen. We've actually had that. Now, fortunately for everybody in this room, it was in my Rockwall office. But we did exactly that. We found out we had no coverage because, we didn't get a demand letter to them, and we ended up in a lawsuit. And cost of that was totally out of pocket for the market. I know, But here's somebody. So these are things that are not just hypothetical. These are things that happen. One of the jobs that I have, one of the jobs that leadership has here, when we get demand letters, when we get things, we deal with it. The number of lawsuits we actually end up with, number of TREC complaints we end up with is fairly small. The number of demand letters is high. We deal with that almost daily. Yes, ma'am.
Would the complaints come to us or to the broker?
Well, typically, if it's a TREC complaint, it comes to the broker. But what happens in a demand letter is usually it's some on the other side that's a demand to the agent or to the sellers. And then as soon as you see that, you get it to me. You go from there. One of the things that I talk about, and I only joke about it a little bit, you got the people on the other side, or even your client, and they're using the A word, which stands for attorney. Well, that A word.
Is everybody looking at me?
And so when they start talking about, say, you know what, we need to talk to our attorney, we got, you say, oh, thank you very much. Maybe he said, well, because I don't have to talk to you anymore. Here's Bob's number. When they start talking about legal issues, get out of it, because you may do something that really gets your problem, send it to me, I'll deal with it. But don't continue to move down that road. When they start using that kind of language, we want to, what happens most of the time when you do that is say, oh, no, we're kidding. We really don't need to talk to an attorney.
That demand letter doesn't have to come from an attorney. It can come from the buyer themselves.
Yeah.
So if you get any sort of demand letter, email, or anything like that, make sure Bob knows about it. So if we do flip insurance companies, we can at least send the old one, hey, this is just notification only in case it manifests and blows up.
Perfect.
All right.
What is that? What is that?
Well, it won't say demand letter, but it could just say,
If I get one out, no.
you'll know when you
Yes,
get
if you
one.
get a complaint of any way, shape, or form, and you're not sure what it is, oh, talk about it.
Yeah, I know.
And Bob and I aren't going to run and press a panic button, but we're also going to make sure that there isn't a claim out there that's going to go without representation and insurance, because that becomes really expensive. All right, let's talk about the claims process, and I'm not going to bore you with details on this. The key thing is to have a central place to house all of your information. And by the way, we'll make these slides available after the class, so you don't need to take pictures unless it's to take pictures of Bob and I. Gosh, when I just say me, people don't laugh nearly as hard, huh? The thing to keep in mind about this is if I turn around and said, all right, give me your voicemails and your emails and your text messages from last week, you'd easily be able to replicate it. But the problem is most E&O claims come in between 6 months and 12 months later. So I'm not asking you for the file you closed last week. I'm asking you for the file you closed last February or March or April. And then the question is, do you have all those text messages? Do you have all those voicemails? Do you have all those items of information? The key thing
Remember
is
that track complaint, years, goes back 4 years. So something that happened, in 2019, you go, but once you pull up all the documentation, which you'll have, then it'll refresh your memory. Say, oh yeah, I remember that. And then we go through that process because you didn't have that. So the lawsuit, depending on the nature of it, 2 years, depending on whether it's ended up with a GPA or whatever. Yes, ma'am.
Quick question. Do you recommend that we print out all email correspondence and keep it in our folder for our clients?
Okay.
Or put it just electronically?
Okay, so the question comes on all of our emails, which, by the way, is a fairly new last year requirement to track everything. Emails, text, all this stuff, you got to keep all that. If you have the emails stored in the cloud, that's good. The challenge with just having emails on your phone is you lose them. You lose the phone, you lose the emails, you switch phones and you lose half that stuff or all of it. And so you've got evidence there that could help us that we don't have. So taking that and running it up to the cloud, same thing, you can convert text to emails, you can send all that up to the cloud. It gets cumbersome when you're doing a lot of stuff to, have the paper copies of it. So as you put up in the cloud, and that's the way to do it. Yeah.
And as you'll see the saying up there, no real estate professional ever expects to get sued. And if you're unlucky and one day find yourself across the aisle from an angry homeowner, I almost said hangover. But the unexpected does happen. So the best thing is to be prepared, and the key to being prepared is to document. All right, about half of all settlements get settled without any payment. So you know how Bob was saying we get all these letters, but they don't necessarily get lots of money. So you're getting a lot of demands that are, in my opinion, frivolous. Why else would no money be paid out? So part of this is recognizing, not necessarily in a case where something's going to get paid out to the other party, because you're going to see a claim later on in the class where it was absolutely frivolous, but guess who got paid? The lawyers, right? And it cost over $13,000 to make it go away. Almost all claims are settled without going to trial, and that's due to the cost of having to defend a case when it goes to trial. So the most common types of claims, bar none, misrepresentation and non-disclosure. Whenever I call up an insurance company, what's the most common claims? That's the exact same thing. And by the way, it's the same thing for almost every industry that handles E&O insurance. And, you know, one company will say a lack of documentation, but a lack of documentation is not a reason for a claim. It just helps you get out of the claim. The second item is undertaking or doing things beyond your areas of expertise. Why do you do that? Because you all are in the referral business, right? You want to provide the best possible experience. So you tend to do things that don't necessarily belong under the umbrella of real estate. We're going to talk about that. So when it comes to failure to disclose, all known defects must be disclosed. Realtor has the duty to ensure that the seller's disclosure is accurate without assisting with the completion of the seller's disclosure. So if you know something's wrong with the house and your seller is refusing to mention it on the seller's disclosure, that's a problem.
Yeah, if you have that happen, you've got to make a judgment call. Because if there's something that should be disclosed and it's not, and if it's something you know about, when the complaint or the lawsuit hits, it'll hit us as well as the seller. So you've got to make a judgment call about not continuing with that seller, because what else are they not telling us about? Now, don't just lose the deal. Remember, you've got this list, hopefully it's a short list of agents you don't like. Refer this seller over to one of those agents, get a referral fee and move on. And, you know, but you do have to be careful. And it's a real important balancing act. And Barney kind of said it, when you have information on something, we just had this. The seller had talked to our agent about foundation work and it had a, you know, foundation, you know, warranty, all that kind of stuff. But in self-disclosure, and that question said no. Now he said, you know, I thought we kind of, he said, oh, the reason I said no is it's been taken care of. It's cured. It's been fixed. Well, it's a yes. It's not a no. And we've got to be able to help him think about that. Think about what the question really means. Do it correctly without him thinking that we've told him how to complete it. Because if it ends up in a complaint or a lawsuit, it's just when, you know, I was so appreciating my agent who really helped me know how to fill out that self-disclosure notice. We're in trouble. So you need to be really careful working through that.
One of the largest claims and the largest claim on my book had to do with a buyer was going out or a potential buyer was looking at a house. They're looking at the house and there's roof work being done on the house. Like bam, 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 bam. So the buyer's agent calls up the listing agent and says, you know, it's a nice house, but you probably shouldn't have roofers working on the roof while you're showing the house. But guess what? The seller's disclosure said there was nothing wrong with the roof. That was a problem because the buyer moved into the house and there were major problems, major water damage. It was due to the roof. And guess what? The listing agent knew there was something wrong with the roof because they had gotten a call from the buyer's agent advising them that somebody was working on the roof. That's how bad it can become. But that's just a good example of when you know something that isn't in sync with the seller's disclosure. And believe it or not, the seller's disclosure is designed to protect all of you. But it has to be properly executed to do so. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Seller Shield later on in the class. Let's talk about as is. As is does not mean it's litigation proof. If there's something materially wrong with the house, it needs to be disclosed. Even if you're selling the house as is, because it can still result in potential lawsuit and litigation. Misrepresentation, some of the examples can come down to square footage, what schools it rolls up to, usage or zoning. Making claims that repairs have been made when they haven't, typically foundation, roof, things of that nature. Other misrepresentations, interestingly enough, flood zones and septic, whether it's city or whether it's, you know, on site. The flood is an issue when you have somebody who has paid off their house hasn't needed a mortgage for 10 years, and maybe the flood zone has gotten rezoned. So the seller doesn't know that they're in a flood zone, so they don't disclose it. The buyer moves in, they find out they're in a flood zone, and things become a problem. All right, let's talk about, yes,
Quick question. We have a lot of investors who own homes here and they've never lived in them. So they filled out the seller's disclosure, but that they have never lived in this property and answer to the best of their knowledge.
so the key,
What is the risk there?
the risk there is minimal, except you want to make sure that that buyer gets a home inspection. Right? Because the combination of the two could really become problematic. In my
The
opinion,
seller filling it out to the best of their knowledge.
as long as there isn't something you know that's wrong with the house.
Okay, so the concept of the seller sight unseen or never lived in it, thinking that gives them any breaks at all, it doesn't. We just had this happen. Our agent had the seller investor who said, I never lived there. I don't really know anything. He rehabbed the house. He knew a lot. He had a lot of information. And said, you've got to make sure you disclose all that. And for someone like that, we don't want them filling out the short track form. We want them filling out the Texas Realtor form. Because we want more information. We want them to do more than the minimum requires. If you've got the buyer and you know that it's been a flip, make sure your buyer does an inspection. Make sure they go through that process. Because while legally they can rely on what this seller says in the seller disclosure notice, truth is, no, they don't. They've got to make sure they get the information on their own. So be very careful with that. Yes.
A little bit further on that. So the home has been a rental and they have a manager, a property manager handling everything. The property manager knows probably if they've had to do repairs during that time. So would it be prudent?
So if it's under property management and repairs have been made, that information should have gone to the owner. The owner should have that information, even in a good property management agreement. Is that not correct, Cynthia?
That's correct.
So you would make sure all those things the property manager has done that we help the seller and saying you're responsible because you have knowledge. Sometimes you have to jog your memory a little bit on how, just think about what you really do know. And, oh yeah, you're right. We did have new HVAC put in 2 years ago and a property manager handled all that. I forgot about it, so sometimes you have to jog your memory, but what they know, they're held responsible for it. If they have it under property management, by the way, it's not a terrible idea for you to talk to the property manager. Say, okay, I'm listing this property, work through the process, selling. You may end up selling maybe an investor property, go to another investor who may be going to use that property manager. You're going through that process. So, you go through, kind of give a heads up to that property manager. Here's what's going to happen. Here's what you're going to do. So that's great. And then go through the process and see if there's anything that any red flags that pop up that you're going to tell you about. And then talk to your client about. You don't represent the property manager, you represent the owner of the property. And that's your client that you work with. But sure, and I've sent it out a couple of times. You want to see it again, send me an email. The list of 11 sellers we're not required to do the seller's disclosure notice. You need to know who those are. Being clueless, never lived there, doesn't get you on the list. So you need to make sure you understand. And by the way, even if you're on the list, if you have knowledge of defects, you still have to disclose it, even though you don't have to complete that seller's disclosure notice. You need to be comfortable with that process. Yes, ma'am.
Back to this misrepresentation on MLS, if we put something in special remarks that says buyers and buyer's agent required to further investigate this information is deemed reliable, or good but not reliable, does that protect you at all?
That little disclaimer in there where it says, you check square footage, you check this, you check that, whatever. And that's a nice little thing to have. We don't find the courts look at it very kindly. You want to have it there. But if you've got anything that causes you concerns, and certainly if you're on the buyer side, you need to make sure your buyer understands. That's not the gospel. You need to do your own investigation, your own research, check on things. It's a nice thing to have there. It's kind of a blanket statement. But the plaintiff attorneys say, you know what, we can just step right past that. And they can. And it depends on the court you end up if you end up in court. It's a good thing to have.
Especially if you know about it,
Yeah.
right? Then it's problematic. All right, so let's talk about offering advice outside of real estate. Anybody here an attorney? Licensed? Okay, then don't give legal advice because you're not licensed to do so. Anybody here a registered financial advisor? No? Okay, so then be very, very general about real estate returns. You can say, here have been the returns for the last 10 years. Here have been the returns for the last 20 years. But stay away
I
from,
just heard from one of the Zoom people, they say they can't hear anything.
and they're complaining.
Tommy, could you go check with Suze or someone and see if she?
Is that an old message, Bob, or is that a new?
Want to say what?
Is that an old or new message? Because we correct.
Let me see.
People online, give thumbs up if you can hear us or thumbs down if you can't. All right. That's almost
Bob,
let them go up.
excuse me, Bob, I was on the link from the calendar. And the class isn't coming through there. Sue's had to send me another link and there were
Okay,
14
okay.
people on that.
Okay, good to know.
Very good.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, so hopefully we're good.
And my favorite one, anybody here a licensed home inspector? All right, well, you know where I'm going with that. Now, let's talk about attending the home inspection. Good or bad?
Good.
Here's
The buyer or the seller?
Here's the problem with attending the home inspection, in my opinion. You are now armed with information you wouldn't normally be armed with.
Yeah.
And what are you gonna do with that information? Right? Are you gonna turn around and say, oh, that crack, it's no big deal? Or that fit on the floor, it's no big deal. You know, you can't give opinions. You have to recommend, but you don't want to become the home inspector either. So it's a very, very fine line between attending the home inspection, being armed with all this information, and not being able to really share it. So you have to be really, really careful.
Question?
There were some occasions where the seller insisted that, you be there for the home inspection. And so what would you say to that?
So you're representing the seller?
I'm representing the seller.
Okay, first of all, you need to know, seller has that right, their house. If they want to be there for inspection, they can do it. You would recommend against it. What we have to be careful of, the biggest challenge we have with sellers who are there is interfere with the inspection. Or they kind of walk around and kind of guide that inspector and keep them away from certain things or whatever. But they have that right, and we discourage them. We can't keep them from doing it. The other challenge is buyers showing up with the inspector and you're not there, or no agents there. Under paragraph 7A of the contract, they have a right to do that. It's a terrible idea. I want to say it was your listing that buyer it wasn't just the buyers, it was the whole family and their kids, and the kids were playing with the seller's toys. And the seller came home early while that was going on and just blew up and we lost the listing. But you want to be very careful. Under the terms of the contract, buyer has a right to be there with the inspector. Not a good idea. Needs to be an agent present as you work through it. But unless you put something in your relationship and your buyer rep agreement or something, you say, can you do it? Or if the seller says buyer can only access the property with their agent, something of that nature, because it can be pretty challenging as you work through that. So most of it, what I hear on the inspection is you show up towards the end when the inspector is going to do a summary and things like that. And that's fine as long as the buyer's right there. We should work through that. Do you have a question?
Oh, no,
So there was actually a situation where the buyer's family, they actually, instead of sending a buyer love letter, they sent a buyer love video. But this is my family and how we can interact in the house. And it did not go over very, very well. All right, primary duty of the client, wrapping this whole section up, is to provide relevant information, but not making the decisions. You're giving them information so that they can have pros and cons and then make their own decision, and then document the information you're providing. And remember, they are the decision maker.
Okay, we say that, we say it all the time. We even kind of believe it. It's not true. It's not true. You make decisions for your client every day. How you show a property, which property you show, how you market property, how you go through the process, what you disclose to your client. You can't disclose everything. You're always making a decision what's relevant. Where they need to know to make good decisions. Which means you're making decisions about what's relevant to them. So you need to really make sure you understand what is relevant. Fortunately, we do have it, and I think we're gonna have it again next month. It's called Mind Reading 101. Read the mind of your client, because you need to do that. Not to be able to work good, because we make decisions all the time for our client. We need to recognize that. Be careful as we do it. We will do it, so be careful.
This will probably be the last class where I have this slide. But the interesting thing was, we really didn't have any COVID claims. We didn't have any buyers suing sellers and blah, 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 because they caught COVID. All right. I love this example because I got a call from a real estate office and says, we would love to put an air freshener or offer air fresheners, not this particular one. And I'm like, well, what do they do? And they said, well, they'll make the house smell like cinnamon rolls instead of cat urine.
So that's supposed to say smell instead of smell.
Yeah, get rid of the cell. Make get rid of the cell too. It's the first time anyone has pointed that out, and I've probably given this class 100 times. And I thought they're all looking at the zit on my forehead, but it's a misspelling, right?
Tom knows it smells.
This is a bad decision, obviously, right? Because you're not only misrepresenting a problem with the house, which is an odor, you're aiding in that misrepresentation. Don't mess with smells. Doesn't mean if you want to bake cookies so that the house smells like cookies, that's okay. But don't do it to mask a problem with the house. Let's talk about what's considered part of the house. So we actually had one claim. You see those beautiful shelves that are hanging up on the wall right there? Well, it was kind of bookshelves, length of the wall that were built in. There was only one problem. They weren't built in. They were cut out to fit that wall perfectly. So the buyer goes to move into the house and wants to know where their built-in bookshelves are. So make sure you verify the bookshelves are indeed built in. We had one situation where window treatments were thrown in. Okay, not a big deal. Guess what? The window treatments matched the comforter. So the seller said, okay, yes, we'll throw in the comforter because it matches the window treatments. So the contract says bedding is included. The buyer goes and moves in and says, where's the bed sheets? Again, it just shows the need to be clear. Mirrors. When is a mirror built in? When it's permanent, or when is it included? When it's permanently attached. So make sure everybody is on the same page, especially when you're dealing with a higher end home. Same thing with fireplace screens and media equipment. Make sure it's permanently installed. When it comes to throwing in a large amount of personal property, my recommendation is you have the buyer and seller do a separate buy-sell agreement between them. Why? Because if there's a problem with what was being thrown in, you're out of it. Let the buyer and seller bicker amongst themselves. The other thing it will do is it will help your mortgage company. Because if they get a contract that says that somebody's paying $800,000 for the house and all the property's being thrown in, then they got to figure out, okay, what part of that 800,000 is the house and what part is the personal property being thrown in? Any questions on this? Yes.
So if you put that on a non-realty addendum, that would still be part of the contract.
Correct.
So it really needs to be completely separate bill of sale.
Right. If it's just a refrigerator or a washer and dryer or something like that, use that. But if it's a bunch of property, then I recommend a separate agreement so that you're out of it.
This becomes a lender conversation. And the lenders are not happy when you have a lot of things on the non-realty item addendum. You would think it would be best if the amount that's being paid is zero. But they don't even like that. So you need to make sure. And in many of your high dollar properties, we had 1.5 million. And the amount of furniture and everything that was going to be thrown in was $200,000. Well, lender's gonna go nuts with that. So, if they want to do it on a separate bill of sale, and there's no form for that, they'd have attorneys draw that up. And the most important part they need to understand, which Marty just mentioned, that's separate from the contract. So if they move forward and they get into a dispute over what's included in that bill of sale, they still have to perform under the contract. Two separate contracts, two separate agreements, and one doesn't touch the other, as you work through the process. So be careful of the non-realty item addendum, because if you have too many things in there, be a problem. So always have the buyer talk to their lender about it. Janet?
I think the hard part about keeping them separate is one isn't happening if the other doesn't happen. Like, I'm not selling you this if you don't buy my house.
Yeah.
So.
So the reality is, what Jan says, what they intend is the bill of sale, all this stuff. By the way, if I don't get all this stuff, I'm gonna buy your house. Well, that's not what the documents say. That's why they have to have an attorney involved. They may even have some situation where they do it. If you make some reference in the contract to the bill of sale, now the lender's involved. They're gonna keep those separate. They really are separate. It takes a good attorney language in the bill of sale. Say, you know what? Hey, here's the deal. If we don't have the contract, because what you don't want is all of a sudden something happens and your buyer's not going to buy the house, so you get to buy the house and you find sales, where do you want us to send that furniture? That $200,000 worth of furniture, then you got to build a sale for it. So you've got to be very careful with that, because, the party's thought here is this only happens if this happens, but that's not what the documents say. So you have to be very careful. That's why they need advice of counsel. Make sure they draw out the language. Otherwise, you've got a problem.
You need to see that with you that came in the mail.
Say that again. Say again.
See you later, babe.
Let's talk a little bit about backup contracts, and Bob, this is probably more your thing than mine. But when you represent the seller and the listing, can anybody think of a situation where you can get out of that primary agreement or primary position?
Say it again.
Say it again.
What's the
Like if you get moved into the primary position.
Okay, so you represent the seller and you're in a contract.
Right.
So is your question, are there ways for that seller to get out of that contract?
Right.
Yes.
Now a secondary position comes in that's much more favorable, that's for more money, that requires less contingencies.
So this is what I'm gonna get rid of the
They
first.
usually look into ours.
Other than earnest money.
Yeah, the only pre-printed text, you're right, is the earnest money issue, and that's it. There'd have to be something else that was added to that seller's notice termination contract. But so, and I know you've got up here, the seller's got a backup contract, doesn't have to be disclosed unless he feels like it's their advantage. So the seller doesn't have to tell anyone else about this backup contract. Obviously, the buyer in the backup contract knows there's an existing contract, otherwise it wouldn't be in a backup. There's confidential information about this seller being in a backup contract. He doesn't have to tell the first buyer, oh, by the way, I've got a backup in better than yours. So when he probably would say that is when he's got a situation where the buyer is really beating up on repairs. It says, you know what, I got a backup better than yours anyway, so I can do any repair if you don't like it, move on, have a nice day. It may become an important negotiating thing.
Thank you.
Well, one thing, and I don't even know why I need to say this because it keeps happening though. Backup contract, earnest money, option fee. Paid right up front. Paid as provided in the contract, and the contract says right then. Now, the parties can change that, by the way, under advice of counsel. But that, for that backup contract, when it first becomes a backup contract, earnest money and option right away. All other performances that are tied to the effective date are now tied to the amended effective date. One of your challenges on your backup contract is a closing date. We can put in there as a closing date.
You don't know.
You don't know. So you may say 20 days after the amended effective date of the contract. A crazy situation, because once you move into the first position, then you've got a certain period of time to go ahead and perform, whatever you think that might need to be. So.
All right, we're going to go through some claims or scenarios that I consider the equivalent to driving on ice. Now, just because you drive on ice doesn't mean you're going to have an accident. But for those of you that were sending text messages and reading your phone while you were driving on the way to the office, you may not have the guts to do that if it was icy out on the road. And why is that? Because you programmed yourself that driving on ice is dangerous. And so that's what I'm going to try to do, is to program you guys, you all, still a little New Yorker coming out of me,
It's a good job, though.
trying. Here's an example of some of the transactions that I'm referring to. Agent-owned properties, and some companies define agent-owned as 25% or greater ownership. Some it's 10%. Your company is actually 10%. We're going to talk a little bit about joint representation, which isn't really joint representation, acting as an intermediary. I'm going to give you a couple of claim scenarios where the buyer and seller are no longer in town and it created claim situations. REO properties, the problem with those is no seller's disclosure. We're going to talk about a claim where an agent should have picked up on a funny feeling with the potential buyer. So here's an example, and Bob's going to correct me on this. But you go in, you represent the seller. You're hosting an open house. I come in and I want to buy the house. I want to put a contract on the house. You asked me who my realtor is. And I said, I don't have one. Can you go and transact it for me? And all of a sudden you're thinking, wow, I can actually get 6% instead of 3%. This sounds like a really good deal. It's very, very important if you're going to even, Bob even permits it, to have the buyer sign something similar to this with wording similar to this. It says buyer tenant is encouraged to seek representation from a licensed real estate broker or attorney. The other example is when you act as an intermediary. And when you act as an intermediary, you represent neither, right? You're just acting as a conduit. And what courts are going to be, whether you're dealing with scenario number 1 or number 2, is that there was full disclosure to all parties so they know exactly what your role was within the transaction.
Okay, so let's talk about intermediary. And I get a bad rap on this. I was just talking to one of the brokers with one of our KW offices, and we were talking about intermediary, and he said, Bob, I understand in your office you don't allow it. No, that's not true. I'm not a fan of intermediary because there's a lot of risk, and I'll talk about the only silver lining in it. But the way it should be done is an agent on either side. That the broker appoints listing agent represents seller, buyer's agent represents buyer. And we're moving forward in an intermediary. Everybody can give advice and opinions to their client. The buyer's agent can help the buyer negotiate a transaction even against the interest of the seller, because he owes the fiduciary to use that buyer client within the limitations of intermediary. So that's the right way to do it. Occasionally what happens is you represent the seller and an unrepresented buyer comes along, wants to buy the property. And there's a tendency to say, well, I can take this person on and get the whole thing and whatever. That buyer only has one of two situations. They're capable of representing themselves, in which case you keep them as a customer. You don't take them on as a client, and you get everything that's in the listing agreement. Whatever's in the listing agreement, that's yours. And you're working with an unrepresented buyer, which is a risky situation. You be careful about that. We'll talk about that in a minute. If you take the buyer on as a client while you also represent the seller, this buyer doesn't get anything. The only thing that gets confidentiality, and your seller is lost to everything except confidentiality. No advice or opinion to either side. You're totally neutral. You've got this seller who you sold on this listing and how you're going to do all these great things for them and you're their advocate and everything. And then all of a sudden, through no fault of their own, because you're going to represent a buyer, they lose them. I don't know how you justify your commission when you've got that situation. It's not a good thing. So I don't prohibit it. What I say is when you have that situation where you say, you know, I've got the seller, here's an unrepresented buyer, they need some help, and I help them to take them on, make a phone call. Let's talk about it. Call our agent hotline, call me, let's talk about it. And there's a process. We'll have a conversation about it. Because if that buyer needs help and you already represent the seller, you can't help take them on as a client. They don't get any help. So you get somebody else in our office, take them on as a client, have an intermediary, one on each side and work through that process. The only silver lining for intermediary, there are two agents here, they're both our agents. So service should be better, should be a better situation because they're our agent, well-trained agents. That's better than our agent and an agent in another company. You should work through that. So that's a good situation. Intermediary only exists within this office. It's another agent in this office. I occasionally get the question because I'm a broker in Rockwall. Well, it's a Rockwall listing and I would buy her on that. I said, no, not intermediary. Because every market center has a corporate broker's license and it's all under that corporate broker. Even though you could have the same broker of record from multiple offices, it's the corporate broker's license. So we don't have intermediary between companies. But when you have an intermediary situation, it's a phone call. We'll talk, we don't prohibit it, we just say there's a process. Questions on that?
By the way, Texas is one of the only states that will even permit an intermediary. That's how dangerous they are.
Yeah.
And you want to talk about driving on ice? For me, it's like driving on ice with bald tires and bad brakes. Doesn't mean you're gonna have an accident, but the chances are a lot less likely. All right, we're gonna go through a string of claim scenarios now. And the first one we're gonna talk about is a claim called at the house. So what happens is buyer, you represent the seller. Buyer comes in, puts an offer on the house, goes and has a home inspection. Sounds okay so far, right? So the buyer's agent sends over a list and say, hey, here's the things from the home inspection we would like the seller to take care of. So you call up the seller and say, Mrs. Seller, what do you want to do? They're like, gosh, I've already moved to Seattle, started my new job with Microsoft. Can you just take care of it? Okay, on the repairs. Now, let's say that the house is located in Midlothian. It's far drive to Midlothian, right? About 45 minutes. And the handy person, which is the person that just brought Jason's Deli to the office, you go and meet you out in this house in Midlothian. And then you turn around and say, well, you know what? It's only going to take you a couple hours. It's 45 minutes there, 45 minutes back. I'll just plug in to my laptop and while you're doing the work. Okay, it doesn't sound horrible so far, except the realtor did choose the vendor. The vendor, while they brought great lunch, had no insurance. But the realtor was there the whole entire time. And instead of just handing over the repair work and said, here's the items that have been addressed, the realtor said, the items have been fixed. Now, you don't ever know whether or not something's been fixed. You have a repair bill. But what happened is it was a perfect storm. The realtor was there the whole time and then made the claim that the items had been fixed. And so the opinion was that the realtor was there basically supervising the work. So when they say it's been fixed, it had been fixed. The best thing to do is say, here's a copy of the repair bill. Please feel free to have your buyer re-inspect to make sure it's repaired to their satisfaction. Right, that's that. Okay. A cockroach came and ran up the aisleway here. Anybody leaving the class? Snake, mouse, rodent, baby. So the largest claim, Travelers Insurance, which is the large insurer ever had to deal with snakes. And it was a house in the Midwest and there were snakes in the basement. Not a ton of them, a couple of them. Not poisonous, you know, you get step on them or whatever. Or in Texas, take a shotgun. But here's the problem. The realtor said, I wouldn't be concerned about the snakes. We can have an exterminator come and take care of it. They're probably in the house because of all the rain we've had. Bad move. Don't ever give an opinion on the treatment of any kind of bugs, snakes, vermin, or anything like that. Let the buyer make their own determination. Because if you turn around and say, we can get rid of those cockroaches and there's an ant crawling along their kitchen floor, you may get a letter about the ant. Let them make the decision to get an exterminator and get their professional opinion without you giving the opinion as to why all of a sudden there's snakes in the house. Because the long and short of it is the exterminator came, the snakes temporarily left, they closed on the house, the snakes kept coming back, they exterminated, they came back, they exterminated. They ended up leveling the house. Because they couldn't get down underneath to get the dirt to get rid of the snakes. When it comes to any sort of written evidence, whether it's a home inspection, repairs, the example I like to give is you have the example I gave you before, right? You have a contract on the house. and there's a home inspection. And now the buyer doesn't want to buy the house because of the home inspection. So this buyer's agent turns around and forwards the home inspection to you. Now, I've had people ask, well, what if I don't open the email? What if I read the email and don't open the PDF? If you get the email, you get the home inspection. Now, you remember what I said earlier, your obligation is to make sure that you don't know anything inaccurate with the seller's disclosure. So now you have a seller's disclosure here, you have a home inspection here. You may have had repairs done here. So how do you go and address a situation where a home inspection says there's a plumbing issue and the seller addresses the plumbing issue? So do you leave the seller's disclosure as is that says no plumbing issue? Tommy?
You can't, amend it and show the receipts for the repair.
So you always want to, if you have a home inspection, you always want to include that. And if you do repairs, you always want to include that. Okay, but what you don't want is for that buyer to come in and think there was never anything wrong with the plumbing. Because if that person didn't repair it correctly and you knew about it beforehand, it's problematic. So best to give a copy of all the documentation and let the buyer make their own interpretation.
Okay, so from a practical standpoint, first of all, to Tommy's point, Texas Realtor has a form that's an addendum to the seller disclosure notice. So you can update that. The other is that inspection report. You've got to make sure the seller has it, seller reviews it, goes through the process. So you mean, I've got to read that 60-page report and I've got to change my seller disclosure notice and work through all that as well. You have to tell what you know. Probably the best way to do it is to include that inspection report in MLS so the next buyer gets a copy of that inspection report. So they have all the information, and the seller, in the seller's disclosure notice, where he does the addendum to the disclosure notice, where he changes that up, he references to the inspection report that's included. So the buyer now has in the where he's got something in their foundations or whatever their plumbing issues, whatever's in the inspection report, there's C attached. So they now have that information. The key is the seller is disclosing what he knows. He goes through the process, and that's key. Now, if your seller will take the time to read that inspection report and to go for and do a whole new seller's disclosure notice reflecting all that, fine. Seller decision, he gets to do that. 1 out of 3,000 sellers will do that. I'm probably an optimist. So we want to make sure when you have that information, your seller needs to look at it. And seller, by the way, has the right to dispute any and all of that information. So he has the right to do their own inspection report. Says, here's what my inspection report says, here's what yours says, and he's an idiot. So, work through that. And he can produce both reports as you work through it. So
I would also do the same thing if the seller has a foundation company come in. Give a copy of the foundation report. Because we all know if you hire 5 different foundation companies, you're not going to get the same report.
by the way, if you've got 5 reports, all of them go to a buyer. You don't get to pick and choose.
Yeah.
You don't get to say, well, here's the one that's really good. We like this. We don't like these others. Those people, whatever. So, but you don't get to pick and choose. Yes, ma'am.
So
No.
if you you have the seller, you have the listing, the inspection is done. Let's say it's an older home, it's got a lot going on with it. And your seller agrees to make the repairs. And the buyer is still moving forward, you don't have to update the seller's disclosure.
Okay, so here's the thing. For that buyer who provided that information, you don't have to disclose new things to that buyer. They already have it. It's for the next buyer that have to have that information.
If the deal falls through.
If it's developed, falls through and goes through that process, you're right. And by the way, remember, the seller's obligation is to disclose, not repair. Seller doesn't have to fix anything, not anything. He said, well, I'll do these same things, I'm gonna do these same things, but I'm gonna disclose, here's what we know. But he doesn't have to disclose anything to a buyer because he got that information from that buyer. You're exactly right.
All right, so when it comes to forwarding critical information, we're going to spend a little time talking about voicemail. But again, it's making sure you get it in a central location so that you can attach it into command. And so here's an example of an old voicemail box that I had. And you see this box here with the arrow pointing up. When you click on that, this pops up. And guess what I can do? I can either text it to my email or email it to my email. And guess what it's going to do with that voicemail message? It's going to attach a WAV file of the person actually speaking into the voicemail. So if you have a voicemail that's actually critical, email it yourself and then you can attach it into command.
God.
Yeah, great.
I don't know.
I'll tell you when else it's handy. Maybe you're traveling and you want another agent to go and respond to a call you may get in. I don't write down the name and number and then go and text it to somebody. I just forward the voicemail to them. And it works great. All right. We have a
So,
okay.
we're gonna ask about the break.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
Do we need a break? I just bring this forward. So just whenever, if you need to get up and walk out, whenever, that's fine. I get hurt my feelings, but other than that, we're. Everybody go and continue, just keep it on?
Yes.
okay,
Okay.
perfect. So the next scenario I'm gonna talk about is called Coming Up Roses. And in this particular case, the buyer was emphatic about roses. Anybody here like getting roses? I'm sure there's a couple people. Bobby, you like getting
Oh, I love
roses?
getting roses. My wife sends them to me a lot.
Yeah. Well, in this particular case, this buyer wanted to build a mini greenhouse. And so they find a nice townhome. And the buyer goes, well, can I go and build the mini greenhouse in the backyard of my townhome? And the realtor goes, well, let me read through the rules and regs for you. So obviously that is a no-no. But let me tell you a couple other things that are fairly new with rules and regulations. One is investors are buying properties thinking that they can use it for Airbnb. And the HOA doesn't permit it. They may be using it to rent out, and the HOA may have a certain limitation on the percentage of properties that will rent out. So if you have an investor, make sure they check, not you, with the HOA on the permissibility as to what they're planning on using. Yes.
So would that not be under our fiduciary responsibility, knowing that
Your fiduciary responsibility is to recommend they go and contact the HOA, but not to interpret the
That is
HOA
a
docs.
great question. Sure, everybody hears the answer. So essentially, we're talking about the HOA rules. We're talking about all that information. This flows into everything. Title commitments, HOA rules. You cannot read those, interpret them, and tell your client, here's what it says. Here's what you can and cannot do. You cannot do it. You just practice law.
are we permitted to reach out to the HOA, get the documents and simply have?
Well, we've got the documents.
Reach out.
Yeah, well, and it's going to depend on the HOA, even though the law allows us to have it. So I said, no, the only thing I'm gonna give it to the seller. In fact, the only people I want to hear from is title. Have the title company call, we'll send it over. But yeah, you can get it, get your client, tell your client says, you've got to read it, you've got to interpret it. And for some of these, said, you know what, you probably need to have an attorney help you with this. And you need to call the HOA. You need to talk to people there and see what you can and cannot do. That's their responsibility. Our responsibility is to get them information and let them know what their responsibility now is and what ours is not. Remember, it's bad service because they look at us as being that expert. They look at us, they rely on us fixing whatever the problem is. And reality is we can't. But we can't do that. Yes, ma'am.
And follow up that advice with an email confirming that you told them.
Yeah, every time you give any important advice, which probably is most of the time, follow up with an email to make sure you're on the same page with what we've just agreed, what you've just told them. Yes, ma'am.
Can we go back to the inspection thing real quick?
Yeah.
If you upload an
See,
inspection,
when you ask me a question and I answer it, you ignore me, hurt my feelings, Tessa. Okay, go ahead. What was your question?
if you upload the inspection to the MLS, is that not disclosing it?
Oh, good question. Having something in MLS is not the same as disclosure. It's available, it's there, but it's your responsibility on the buyer side to pull it down. Just having an MLS is not delivery. It's not disclosure.
So if you're under contract, on a contract, upload the new inspection to the MLS, right? And then you say, okay, well, everything you need to know is in the MLS. That does not prohibit the seller from.
No, what you're going to do is either take and email it to them or have an acknowledgement from them that they've accessed it. Just having MLS is not sufficient.
And then as far as disclosure goes, that does not, let the seller out of obligation of redisclosing what they know, right?
Say that again?
So like, let's say you have the seller and you upload you fill out a contract and you upload the, inspection to the MLS. They say, well, if we just disclose what we know from that inspection, they still have to go back and amend things, right?
Yeah, because just having MLS hasn't disclosed it. So they're gonna have to make sure however they amend their seller's disclosure notice includes whatever that's there, or at least reference to the seller's disclosure notice, which they can have attached to their seller's. Take the inspection report, which they can have attached to the seller's disclosure notice. Like semi-sense to you?
Yeah, I'm just asking, so my question is, can they take the new inspection report and attach their seller's disclosure to it without making any edits to it?
Yeah, oh yeah, they don't have to make any edit to the inspection.
Just say,
Yeah.
what we just.
Yeah, you wouldn't. Yeah,
That would be my preference,
yeah, absolutely.
because otherwise the seller starts interpreting the home inspection. All right, so we talked about that.
Good.
All right, it never hails in North Texas, does it? So let's talk about a scenario where you have a walkthrough today. There's a hailstorm tomorrow and you're closing on Thursday. And you turn around and tell the buyer, we need to delay closing, and the buyer goes, look, the movers are gonna show up at 110 Elm Street on Thursday. Let's close and I'll deal with the roof issue after. So let me tell you how this is all gonna play out. The buyer closes on the house, calls up their new insurance company and says, I have a hail claim to report. New insurance company says, sorry, we took effect after the hailstorm.
Right.
So now the buyer calls you up and says, I need you to contact the seller. Now, I heard that other realtors don't always call you back right away. And that's when you're trying to buy or sell something between yourselves. So imagine a situation where you're having to call the listing agent back and getting them to contact their seller and getting that seller to contact the insurance company. And let's say everybody cooperates. Now, who's going to cut the check for the $5,000 to $10,000 called the deductible? Is it going to be held in escrow? Possibly. That would solve the deductible issue. But now the repairs get done and the seller goes, okay, I need to get my check for what's called recoverable depreciation, because those of you that have been through a claim, the insurance company holds back some of the money until the repairs are complete and then they release it. That's called recoverable depreciation. Not all companies are going to pay that once the house is sold. So this is going to turn into an absolute mess, and you've got to do everything you can to delay the closing. Any questions? Yeah.
So I have a question. So it's the day before closing on a Wednesday. Tuesday night, there's a hailstorm, scattered hail in the area, but you as the agent, you don't know about it.
Which agent are you?
Buyer's agent.
Okay.
So for whatever reason, I didn't know that there was hail in that area.
You should have gotten something from your broker, IEB. Please, if you have a buyer or you have a property in this area, there's a weather event, please have your client check on it. I'm serious. But Mark, one of our obligations is when we know something like that to remind our agent to check it out. We just went through this with the tornadoes up in Powderly. We're in north of Paris, and we had a house up there scheduled to close this last week. It's severely damaged. One of our agents had that listing, and they're working with a buyer moving forward in the process. But we don't always know. I mean, when things happen, unfortunately, we have buyers and we work with sellers in areas maybe further away than really should. And so you've got somebody over in Fort Worth, and you didn't know there'd been a hailstorm in some area of Fort Worth. But the reality is, whenever there's a weather event in the area, we do try to reach out to you and say, here was a weather event. Do you have a buyer or seller that could be affected there? So you need to have them check it out, do some research, because just because you didn't know it, if a complaint hits, Shrek will look at geographic competency. They'll say you took something outside of your primary market area, that's why you didn't know about it. And so you really couldn't represent your client. You could have a problem. So we really try to do that. To make sure there's not, now, you can't fix all of it. You're always gonna have something that comes up. You're always gonna have, and even as good as you are and do all the things you're supposed to do, things could still happen. But try to avoid it. Yes, sir?
So flip that scenario you just told us about backwards, and we're representing the seller, right? And a hailstorm comes through on Thursday and we're closing tomorrow, right? What would be your advice on dealing with that situation? Obviously, our goal is to help represent the seller and their interests. We don't want them to have to deal with the mess either. So what would
I mean, ideally, you can delay closing a week or so to get the roof up or at least know what the damages are gonna be.
Your seller needs to right away check it out. You talk to their insurance company, whatever. Let them know the liability they could have if they don't do anything and this closes, because then the buyer will come back on them later. You got that scenario that Barney just talked about. So you need to say, hey, here's what just happened. So you need to check it out. You can see what problem you've got. And we know things happen. You've got a hailstorm coming through a neighborhood and everybody's house gets hit with yours. Everybody else is getting a new roof, but your guy. Well, that's not right. I mean, my next door neighbor, they all got here and I don't, you're interested. That happens. That's just how things are. Yes, ma'am.
Follow up your statement to your seller to have it checked out with an email.
Oh, yeah. Always get that acknowledgement. Get an email acknowledgement. Absolutely.
Here, come teach the class.
So you're exactly right. So, to kind of work through that and deal with it. But, whenever, and we've got certain times of the year, in the spring and in this time of the year where we have more storms than normal. So kind of keep an ear out. If you've got active contracts going on and things are happening, and, we had a number of agents up in the Paris and Powderwood area who had listings, who had fires and situations and things happen and there were damages. And then all were right on top of it because they knew the event had happened. They talked to their client and said, what are we going to do? How are you going to work through it? And they helped the client understand their options and what the choices they could do as they work through it. And the contract itself in paragraph 14, casualty loss, we address it there. And you need to be familiar with that and understand how that can work going through the process. Because when it happens the day before closing, there's no way for the seller to take care of it, prior to closing. So you just have to deal with that. And the buyer say, well, let's give us some more time. And they mutually agree to extend the closing date, which almost always they should do.
So most roofers are gonna have access to a software called Hailstrike. And they can pull it up. How do you think when a hailstorm comes, all of a sudden people start knocking on your door? It's because they run a report that says 1¼ inch hail at this block of houses. So if you don't know a roofer, get to know one that's of a decent size other than Chuck in a truck. And, they can go and run this report for you.
Is that report sufficient for the buyer? Like, I've had that report run for most of the homes I've had my buyers buy, and I just give it to them from my company so that they have more information, especially if it's an older.
From a roofing company.
From a roofing company, not me.
Good job.
No, not me. I have roofing companies and then that.
Yeah, good.
On any, they're about to put an house. But is that, so, and it usually.
Certainly a good thing to do. Yeah.
So they'll say, hey, your roof was replaced in 17, but it looks like you had 22 hailstorms in 2017. And then I say, contact your roofer.
So for the Zoomers who can't hear everybody in the classroom, you were just talking about when this happens and you get the information on the roof strikes from the software program that Maureen was talking about, then you get that information to your buyer and let them do the research and check it out. The responsibility is for our responsibility to get them the information and then let them know, here's your next step. Follow up when you send them that good advice, follow up with an email acknowledging that they understand what they need to do, and then follow up with them that they in fact can do it.
So there's other components to hail besides the size. It's the shape. Like sometimes it's more jagged and that will cause more roof damage, as well as the speed in which it falls. So there's other components other than just the size of the hail, but that's a great suggestion. We'll also talk a little bit at the end about clue reports and what those will show on. All right, anybody ever send a text message to the wrong person? Today? All right, this is kind of your warning. And I'll share with you all real quickly a scenario for myself. So, you heard me say you guys, so I'm from New York. I've been a Jets fan all my life, and it's been a very painful 59 years. And so I'm texting with my son back and forth. And while he's very smart, now has a PhD, he is still a Jets fan. In this particular scenario, the quarterback had just thrown his third interception and it got returned for a touchdown. So me, I texted him, this is absolute BS. Well, in came a text message, and it's Sunday, from the wife of a Dallas Stars hockey player that says, hey, Barney, I'm sorry I can't meet you tomorrow. And I respond, this is absolute BS. The great news is she's still a client. It's been like 12 years and we still laugh about it, but just be careful. Okay. This is one of my favorite claim scenarios. If anybody here wanted to move and get away from the busy city life, anybody moving to Fort Worth? All right, this is the actual house involved in this Greenbelt claim. And this house overlooked over here, a very, very nice Greenbelt. Can anybody see anything strange in the top left portion of that picture? Right here.
Construction?
Exactly. And guess what's happening to the Greenbelt? It's turning into a homeowner community.
Oh.
So the buyer's agent gets a letter that says this purchase was intended to be the purchase of their dream home, the culmination of life, toil, sacrifice, and saving. This home was to be their escape from their busy city lives, and all of you knew far better than the plaintiffs. Now, here's the takeaway on this. You have a buyer. The buyer's insidious about or crazy about this Greenbelt. Greenbelts today could be an HEB tomorrow. Right? Or a Target or whatever. If somebody is so crazy and so intense about wanting that Greenbelt or that school or whatever, make sure they contact economic development and make sure there's no construction planned or rezoning planned in the school district or something of that nature. Because this was absolutely frivolous, but it costs over $13,000 to make the claim go away. The only one that got rich on this was the attorneys. Yes.
So how would an agent representing the sellers know that that's why the buyers are buying it? Is this something we should ask if we know there's a Greenbelt nearby to make sure about, or?
So this is a situation where the buyer's agent got sued, not the seller's agent.
Okay,
But when you've got the seller,
okay.
the key is don't make any statement about Greenbelts. Don't be advertising Greenbelts. Don't be talking about Greenbelts. And as long as you don't ever bring it up, we don't have a problem. And by the way, remind your seller not to be bringing it up. We love this view. You're going to really enjoy this for years and years and years to come. Your grandkids are going to really, don't bring it up. So as long as you don't do it, you're good. On the buyer side, it comes down to what you represented, what you knew and should have known, kind of thing.
Well, let me throw out another scenario, and I don't have a clear-cut answer for this. But let's say you know an HEB or Target is going in where that beautiful empty field in the back of the house is. What's your obligation to disclose it?
Who do you represent?
The seller. But everybody knows HEB is going in on that corner, right? So the buyer's agent absolutely knows about that HEB. What's your obligation?
To let the buyer's agent tell us all about it.
Legally none,
Yeah.
but best practice would be.
It could be 5 years from now.
Yeah, of course. What we look at from the seller side, we tend to focus on the property itself, but both Trek and the plaintiff attorneys look at any material fact that could affect a buyer's decision to buy. One of the languages that we're always seeing in a lawsuit is had the buyer known this, they would not have purchased the property. So if they had known there's going to be an HEB coming in, they would not have, So as you work through the process, if you have that information, your recommendation to your seller would be, as you work through this process, we need to make sure a buyer knows about that. And once we have a buyer's agent knows about that, it's totally their responsibility.
I don't know, it's crazy.
That is the best business practice.
As crazy as people are about HEB, you may want to put in your listing, walking distance to HEB.
Yeah.
All right, let's jump on to seller deals. I'm actually going to skip that next claim scenario. Everybody here has heard of Seller Shield?
Yes.
And you're all registered with Seller Shield. We just recently updated our roster. So everybody is registered with Seller Shield, so you can make use of it with your clients.
So let's talk to,
Yes, yes.
so Seller Shield has two components. They have the prevention side, which is completely free to you and to your seller. They have the protection side, which is not. Okay, so the prevention side entails completing the seller being able to complete the seller's disclosure with the Seller Shield tools, including downloading the app that they can go and complete on their phone. Okay, no cost. Why do we push it, Bob and I? Because we want everyone in this room to get out of the practice of helping the seller complete the seller's disclosure. And they can call the number at Seller Shield and say, hey, I have a question on my seller's disclosure, and they're going to assist your seller with the answering of it. Okay. The other part, protection, is if the seller gets sued, then they will get up to $20,000 of legal fees for 1, 2, or 3 years. Now, let me explain what that means and what it doesn't mean. It means they will get free use of the attorneys up to that amount. But let's say the example with the dishwasher that I threw out before, and Seller Shield gets involved in what was an $800 dishwasher, they negotiate down to $400. So the seller has to cut a check for $400, and they're like, well, I have Seller Shield. It was $20,000 in coverage. That $20,000 does not go towards compensating the buyer. It only goes toward legal fees. So it's very important to know when you're explaining that to your seller, it's not a $20,000 insurance policy. It covers legal fees, which are typically the most expensive part of the claim anyway. And some of the available forms, the seller's disclosure notice for both Trek and Texas Realtors, information about lead paint, flood zones, on-site sewer facility, things of that nature. Because again, two of the biggest non-disclosures from my standpoint are flood and sewer. So right away, it's forcing them to answer those questions. And again, 100% free to use unless the sellers decides to buy the protection.
This should be in your listing packet. So that a seller knows about it and can make a decision whether to do it or not do it. So that a year from now, when they get sued and they find out they could have had up to $20,000 in legal fees assistance, but they never knew about it, you didn't tell them about it, I think we got a problem. So we need to make sure they're aware of it, because it is a good service.
I have had people ask in the class before, is it okay to buy it as a closing gift?
Sure. The answer is yes. Just in case you're waffling on that. a little bit.
Yeah.
Yes, you can. Just like you can pay for a home warranty, which we're going to talk about home warranties in a minute, how important those are. You can pay for this. You can have a little closing gift and say, yeah, no, absolutely.
I was going to say that, by the way.
Okay, good.
I was going to say, though, I'd rather have a cutting board than,
Yeah, well,
you know.
Cutco won't like you, but that's okay.
Well, I'll use knives on the cutting board.
Okay.
When it comes to photos, who owns photos? The photographer. If you pay the photographer money to go take the photos, who owns the photos? The photographer. What are you paying the photographer for? For their time. Photography is considered artwork, and using it for a different purpose than was initially designed is considered stealing that artwork. I'm not going to go through the claim scenario I have here because it was California based, but it had to do with cropping the photo, taking off the copyright, and it was a massive claim. But we did have one agent at KW in this region who copied photos from Zillow and got busted.
Yeah.
And they had to pay between $5,000 and $7,500 to make it go away. So again, with photos, make sure, even if you get a flash drive from the seller, that you know where those photos came from. Now, you can get your photographer to sign something, releasing the photos. So if you have a situation where your seller is wanting too much money for the house and you're like, I know where this is gonna go. I'm gonna invest a bunch of money into photography and then the house isn't gonna sell. And then they're gonna go find another agent that will drop the price and it will sell. And they're gonna call you and say, hey, can I buy your photos? Well, unless you have some sort of release from the photographer, technically you cannot sell them. Any questions on that? All right, when it comes to mortgage pre-qualification versus pre-approval, what I try to advise people is if they're going online and they're going to Spaceship Mortgage, they're getting what's called a pre-qualification, not a pre-approval. So you need to make sure when it comes to the third-party financing addendum, down here with the number of days, that you allow for a few more days if it's only going to if it's a pre-qualification letter versus a pre-approval letter. And then for those of you, the biggest mistakes buyers make right before closings.
Wait, before we move on, let's talk about the lender scenario. We all have good relationships. We all have good lenders. We value that greatly. But you need to be incredibly careful. One, the name of the lender doesn't show up anywhere in the contract. Buyers are just switching one, especially with rates passing around a little bit. You need to be, if you've got the seller, you need to be incredibly diligent on your communication with the buyer's lender. See what's going on, what's happening, stay on top of that. If you've got the buyer, you really need to have a conversation with your buyer's lender. Your buyer's lender. Sure, let's work through that and take everything they say with a certain grain of salt. Because some of them are just flat out lying. Some of them are incompetent. Some of them don't know better. I think you need to know enough about the lending process to know whether or not you're talking to an intelligent loan officer or not. You don't need to replace the loan officer. It's too technical, too many things going on, but you need to know whether you talk to. When you call a loan officer and as well, you know, how's it going? He's, oh, great, everything is right on line with chop. Your response should be, I had no idea things were that bad. And then you told you everything they thought you needed to hear and they didn't tell you anything. Well, you need to know the specifics, you know, where are we? Oh, we're good. We keep having situations where we're 2 weeks before closing. And we say, oh yeah, I got cleared to close, everything's good, and we're not. If you got the buyer on a conventional loan, you need to pay attention to the property approval timeline in a third party finance schedule. But if there's something going on from the property approval standpoint that gets them out, you got to do it before the third day prior to closing. FHA and VAs all the way to closing. So before that timeline hits, you need to talk to your buyer and say, here's an important contingency that's about to go away. You need to know from your lender where you are. If we're still having appraisal issues, underwriting issues, title issues, anything, then you make a decision because they're about to put their earnest money at risk. Because if all of a sudden something happens 1 day prior to closing, property approval wise, they're going to be in default if they can't close. So really be careful. I mean, really just get on board with that lender, really make sure you know what they're talking about. Because right now, if the lender's not really helpful to you, it's not going to get better later. So make sure you've got a good lender to work with.
Now, here's some of the scenarios that I've been told by lenders that become problematic is that people like to change jobs, open a business right before they close on a house, purchase a new car, and let them know that that refrigerator they want will be on sale at Nebraska Furniture Mart after they close. Because an opening up is 6 months, same as cash, even though they're wealthy, could potentially delay the close. Yes.
One thing that happened with an agent that I was working with years ago, she had a middle-aged couple. They were buying a home. They had a contract in place and she told them no cars, no furniture, blah, blah. The day or two before closing, the underwriting did another run on their credit and they ultimately were not able to purchase the home because in the midst of it all, they co-signed for their grown daughter and son-in-law to buy a home.
There you go.
and they lost their opportunity. So I've added that to my buyer's commandments.
Yeah, it's a good idea. Don't be co-signing on anything.
Don't co-sign anything.
All right, we're gonna spend a little bit of time going through the computer hacking, the email scenario, and kind of give you some tips. So typically what happens is a password is discovered on a common domain, Gmail, Hotmail, Yahoo, something like that. The hacker will go in and change the password. Then they're gonna start reading through, looking for cash buyers and looking for closings that are coming up. And then the cash buyers are gonna get emails that are gonna come from you, because I'm now in your email reading through, and I found out Bob is closing on a cash deal on Friday. So I'm like, hey, Bob, this is so-and-so, your realtor. We're getting ready to close. Here's your wiring instructions.
Oh, my gosh.
And you may turn around and say, well, what are the chances? I've had 3 claims, 3 different claims. And the largest amount that was wired incorrectly was $275,000. And it was an office in this region.
Oh, my.
All right. So some of the ways that this happens is we all get these emails with links. I got one today from Norton. Hey, thank you for your $299 payment to renew your email or your antivirus. Click here for your receipt.
Oh, no.
So a lot of times when you go up to these links, well, this isn't showing, but I have the mouse right next to it and it will tell you who it comes from. Don't click on it. But if you hover the mouse to the link, it will tell you it can't, like in this case, if it showed up, it would say 10.89.120.2/quarantine/blah, blah, blah. That doesn't sound like somebody wanting to send me a real estate referral. So some of you may say, well, let me just respond. Did you mean to send me that email?
Oh, Lord.
Well, guess what? I'm already in your email, so I'm going to be like, yes, absolutely. Look for spelling errors, because like when I got that Norton email, it came from Norton Mail, not Norton. And so that was an indication, and it was exactly this, a phishing link to allow them into my computer. Anybody hear of something called multi-factor authentication?
Yeah.
And 2-factor. This has become so big that when we go to buy or get cyber insurance for people or for offices, the insurance company's now asking, do they apply multi-factor authentication? And what that is when you go and log in and I have your email and your password, I can't get in unless I have your cell phone with that 6-digit code. And so all the major email services have this. All the social media services have this. I recently got something from LinkedIn that somebody had been running something that I had an abnormal number of requests.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe it was because I was popular or something. But evidently somebody was in there. So I literally went into LinkedIn that day, changed my password and applied the multi-factor authentication. Now I hope it still works and I don't get another email. So here's how you do it on Gmail. You click on security. First thing you do is click like where that B is, and security is an option. When you click on security, you see the second option there, 2-step verification. 2-step verification is also synonymous with multi-factor authentication. You click on that, and then once it's done, you put in your phone number and it tests it, it will show verified. If you don't take anything else away from this class, I would like for all of you to do that for your email and do all of that for your Facebook. It will only ask you for that code if you're logging in from a strange computer or a strange place. How can it affect you? Well, it's not just the wire fraud. They can lock up your computer. There's a virus called the encryption virus, and what that does is it makes all your PDF and Word documents look like this. And the only way you can get them back is by paying a ransom. Well, if you had your documents backed up for multiple days, you wouldn't have to pay the ransom. You would just download the documents from 2 days ago. And for those of you that are saying, well, I back everything up to iCloud, if I load the virus up today and it's backing up tonight, unless you found the virus before that backup, it's gonna infect the backups at iCloud as well. So you need a backup service with multi-days of backups. LastPass is a great app. I use it. It's a great way of storing passwords. It can create passwords that are this long. It's a free app. The nice thing is, if I leave my backpack here and Bob gets into my computer, I can shut down all those stored passwords. Where's the worst place to use public Wi-Fi? Airport. You guys have taken the class, y'all have taken the class before. Well, everybody gets the Starbucks, but how many people are there on a public Wi-Fi at an airport versus Starbucks? Right? Second worst place is the hotel. So when you're on at either of those two places, what I'll do is I will connect right here to personal hotspot, and then I'm using my phone as the hotspot. If you do not have that option on your phone, it means you probably need to upgrade your phone service. And I know in the case of AT&T, it's only $5 more a month. All right, so wrapping this section up, do not click on links that will allow password capture. You may want to advise your cash buyers, because they seem to be the most susceptible, but not the only ones, that you will not give them any wiring instructions. Oh, and by the way, I forgot from the last slide, if you get an email from a title company with wiring instructions, do not forward those on to your buyer, because we now have to assume that the title company was hacked into. Carbonite is a great backup system. They actually, last I looked, it was a 40% off, and for $40 or something a year, you can back up with Carbonite. Ways to reduce your deductible. You have a home inspection or it's rejected. You have a home warranty or it's rejected. You have a seller's disclosure and you use state or board approved forms. Why do you think the insurance company does that? They're not in the habit of cutting deductibles, because if you have those things in your file, the chances of an E&O claim have just become significantly reduced. When it comes to,
Okay, back up. Can you do that? If not, I'll just talk about it. Home warranties.
taking Bob's Coke away so we get out of here.
This is important. Does the other side have the owner agent? Well, I want to talk about the owner agent part. I mean, this is important.
It's the same criteria if you're selling your own property.
Okay, here's the difference. I mean, those same things are there for owner agent, you're selling your own property. Here's the difference. If you don't do these in a regular scenario, we don't get that reduced deductible. If you don't do these, when you're an owner agent selling your own property, you have zero. You know, you have no coverage, period. So if you're selling your own property, you better buy that home warranty for the buyer. You better make sure that gets done. I have one in Rockwell right now. Owner agent, fairly new agent. She did not offer up the home warranty. She didn't understand. She didn't know about it. I feel bad about it. We as a brokerage have no coverage. She has none. So this is good. Help reduce the deductible. If you're an owner agent selling your own property, this is a have to. This is a must. If you don't do this, you could end up with zero errors and omissions. So take that seriously. Make sure you get that done.
So
Question? Wait, you have a question, Janet?
I do.
Okay.
So I'm sitting there going, okay, so you have them sign a form that they don't want the home warranty, or is the fact that in their contract, they said they don't want the home warranty, does that kind of sufficient, right?
Well, they'd have to put special provision on it because, you know, what you talked about, H has, all it has is choice there. So if you offer it up and they say they don't want one, I mean, we heard about those, they're useless, and you got documentation that it's been offered and they chose not to, you're okay. You don't have to do it, but you have to offer it. You have to at least say, yeah, here it is. Same thing with the inspection. If they decide not to do an inspection, you need to say that, well, it was offered and here's the process, and they chose not to. We do, by the way, have a form that when a buyer doesn't do an inspection, that they have to sign off on. This is one of our old Bible forms. But you need to make sure that you at least have offered it up. And if they say, well, I'm warranting, and said, no, I want it, and get an acknowledgement from them, that in fact, they've been given that choice and they chose not to do it, then we're covered. We're good.
Now, you're saying pay for the home warranty. You're also saying for an owner agent to pay for the inspection?
No,
Just make sure
well,
that they.
make sure that either inspection was done or they chose not to have one.
Okay,
Same thing, home warranty. Either a home warranty was done for them or they chose not to have one.
okay.
It's unusual for a buyer who you're about to pay for the home warranty for them to say, no, I don't want one.
By the way, if you're paying for the home warranty, or I'm sorry, the home inspection, let them choose the home inspection,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
right? Because if you pay for it, then any good plaintiff attorney is gonna,
Oh, yeah. they'll get-
say you colluded together. All right, let's continue through because
Yeah, we're running, I know, last 4-7.
was there any others?
Okay,
Because the next subject is everybody's favorite thing to talk about. So when it comes to tenant selection, it's important to use some sort of form that's going to outline what your criteria is.
we have a 5-page model tenant selection criteria from Texas Realtors. That's very good to use.
All right, so for those of you that are thinking about getting into property management, there's 12 reasons not to.
One of them is you're not allowed.
Yeah, we don't have it.
You see those dogs?
That's the
First one.
So let's say you're leasing a house. These are the bad dogs, the pit bull, the Rottweiler, the Doberman, the Chow. And that's Sam. I rescued Sam, and Sam, believe it or not, has pit bull, Rottweiler, German Shepherd, and Chow in him. I'm kidding. I'm not kidding. And he's the most docile animal in the world. But let's say I show up at the house with Sam and you're like, look, sorry, no dogs. And I say this, but he's my emotional support animal.
Yeah.
So what do? Well, what you have to do is treat Sam like I'm carrying just an extra TV set or screwdriver into the house. No extra rent, no extra deposits, and you can't deny me the property. You can't ask for a certificate. Don't ask me why.
You cannot ask for.
You can ask for the certificate,
Okay.
but just don't turn around and say, well, what's your mental problem?
Oh.
Well, I'm being a little bit sarcastic, but what you don't want to do is deny somebody the property because of depression or anxiety or whatever it is, right?
Right.
And if they don't get the house, then they can say that you discriminated against them. Yes.
So if the client can't provide documentation that the animal is a support animal from a doctor, you still have to allow them.
It doesn't even have to be from a doctor. They can get it online for about $80 and a 45-second call from a therapist.
But you need something or you don't get to treat them as emotional support and separate emotional support from service animal. That's it. You had something?
Yeah, I'd like to know if that doesn't just have to be a dog. They can have.
Emotional support doesn't just have to be a dog.
It could be a lizard.
It could be a cat. It could be a bird. It could be a bull constrictor.
Yeah, so.
Protect you while your enemy. But a service dog has to be a dog or a miniature horse.
Right.
That's a link qualified as a service dog.
That's.
See, my dog has registered me as his emotional support unit. Let's talk a little bit about Clue reports. So we're talking about the scenario where you're providing hail stripe, which gives a scenario of the hailstones in a particular date and time. Well, all insurance agents can run what's called Clue report. And Clue report will give you a 7-year history. It used to be 5. It will tell you the dollar amount that was paid, the type of claim that it was, whether it was related to a catastrophe. There's some claims that follow the property and some claims that follow the owner. Now, I will tell you in a scenario with hail, that if a buyer gets a house with a new roof, it's going to be very advantageous. I ran a quote for myself on homeowner insurance for my own house. It was $4,100 because my roof was replaced in 2015. I changed it to 2022 and that 4,100 dropped to 2,900. So your buyers that think, okay, I don't want to buy a house with a roof claim. No, it's way, way advantageous for them to have a new roof on the house. Insurance agents can also run flood zone reports. Flood zones are like they say, it will tell you whether or not a house is in a flood zone. But if you have a house in a flood zone, the important thing to know is the elevation of that house within the flood zone. And who does that elevation report? The survey company. So what you don't want is for your buyer to order a survey and then say, oh gosh, we need an elevation report, and have to basically pay for a second survey company to go out. So if it's in the flood zone, have the survey company while they're out there do the elevation report. Skip over that. All right, let's talk about lease backs. They're common, right? So let's say in a situation where a house is being leased back, it burns down during the lease back period. Whose insurance pays for it?
Property owner.
Should have been predetermined before the lease back.
Okay, so let me explain to you how this plays out. The seller's insurance policy's out because they no longer own the house, and you can only insure things you own. For any of you that are insuring your children still on your car policies, and they don't own the car and they don't live in the house, you're gonna run into claims problems. Same thing, you can't insure something you don't own where you don't have an interest. The seller's contents would continue to be covered under the home policy because they still own their contents. Now, the problem is the buyer has bought a house. They took out a mortgage because it was their primary residence. And they have an insurance policy and a homeowner policy that says we will insure a home in which you reside. They're not residing in it. That's why for those of you that have rental properties, you don't have a homeowner policy on it. You have what's called a dwelling fire or a landlord policy on it because it takes away that language. The only thing I want all of you to know in this room, because there's a few workarounds, is to make sure your buyer addresses the lease back with their insurance agent so that you don't run into this problem. Because like our firm, we represent 12 to 15 different companies for home insurance. They all have a different time frame and position on lease backs from 0 days to don't worry about it. And what you don't want is for your buyer to be with one of those 0-day companies on a 7-day lease back. Any questions on that?
Let me make one quick comment on lease backs. Stellar Timber residential lease. The new requirement in the property code, it's actually in paragraph 23 of the Stellar Timber residential lease. It requires the landlord to provide that addendum for floodplain disclosure. Even though the information the buyer has on this, they got from the seller. The seller disclosure notice. I think the legislature is going to fix this. They just failed to exempt this particular thing. We've got 2 other exemptions on temporary residential lease, security devices, smoke detectors that you don't have to do because it's a temporary lease up to 90 days. But if you've got the buyer and there's going to be a stellar temporary residential lease, your buyer has to include that addendum with that offer, and they've got to sign off on it. They've got to complete it on a stellar temporary lease. You got to make sure that gets done. It's stupid, it's silly, it's ridiculous, it'll get fixed, but right now it's where we are.
Similar issue with vacant homes. I'm not even going to begin to explain how to define a house as being vacant. Because whenever I've pressed an insurance company to define it, they're like, oh, it's subject to adjuster interpretation. If you have a buyer or a seller and their house is going vacant, just recommend again that they address it with their insurance company. Foundation claims. Many insurance companies now have an endorsement that says foundation coverage. What that does not cover is general settling. What it covers is if there's a leak under the slab that caused the movement in the foundation, then there could be potential coverage. Why do I bring this up? You have a situation where a house has foundation damage and they don't do a pre-leak test. They put in the piers, they do the post-leak, and they're like, oh, you had 3 sewer leaks. No wonder why your foundation was messed up. It's too late to report it to insurance once you put the piers in. So if there's damage inside the house cracked walls, cracked floors, and they think there may be leaks under the slab, have the foundation company do a pre-leak test. Will cost about $200. And if there are leaks, get it reported to insurance if there is that foundation endorsement. All right, tips to avoid lawsuits. Maintain good communication. Be liked. We haven't really helped them be liked, have we, Bob?
And in fact, we're gonna have a class on how to be likable. Our first problem was, who's gonna teach it? You think you're likable? Let me tell you about it. So here's, and I want to see if you got a good sized group here. I want to see if all of you are on board with my suggestion. Tommy Thompson. Yeah. I haven't met anyone who doesn't like Tommy. So I think he's going to teach you how to be like a player.
I personally have a list of grievances, but we'll do that.
The biggest problem with being likable, you either are or you're not. You can't learn how to be likable, I don't think. It's just something that's there. He's been likable, forever, but there's no question. Being likable is a huge deterrent to lawsuits and track play. Huge. It cannot overestimate. So that's important.
Bob and I are going to give a class called How to Avoid Being Liked. Avoid giving false expectations. Document your advice and avoid the difficult and unethical client. And put their interests first. Recap, we talked about agent-owned properties and reducing your deductible, those 4 requirements. Avoiding the crazy, remember the green belt. And how you need to put, have your radar open to pick up on oddities. Dual agent transactions and the need to call Bob if you're involved in any situation like that. Cyber and email, clicking on links, double factor or multi-factor authentication, and the need for tenant selection to avoid discrimination issues. And that's all I.
So, a question? Okay, an announcement?
Now it's all like. Just this coming Friday at 11 o'clock is our vendor appreciation luncheon that we've been doing for 9 to 11 years in our market center. And everybody's invited to come and say thank you to all the vendors that we will invite here to say thank you for all their services to us, and they support us. There's sign-up sheets for if you want to bring a dessert or a side dish. Lee says she's bringing her sardine casserole. I think she really likes that a whole bunch. And that was split pea casserole. I think Ruby's bringing that. But we're going to provide turkey and brisket as an office. Ask all y'all to be here to support our vendors because they support us massively. And if you want to stay and help us clean up, that'd be even better. Right. So 11 o'clock Friday. And bring food. Thank you very much. Bring food. Yep. Blood drive. What's that? Blood drive. December 1st. December 1st. Blood drive. Blood drive. And if you don't want to give blood, Charlie will make you give blood.
For you, this time, but December 1st in our parking lot.
Okay, one quick last thing here. Yes, sir.
Sign up online.
Then,
Any word or how they're looking on any do not call situations, do not call.
okay, we will send out, it's a 3-page document that we got from regional to all of you, and it talks about the do not call, it explains it, talks about the rules, what you can and can't do. Appreciate you bringing it up because we need to really pay attention to it. We've got national do not call. We got in state, we've got an internal. On our internal do not call list, we've only got 2 people on. So sometimes we'll have somebody that does it, and Angie, our MCA, is the one that keeps our internal do not call list. So it's one of those things that talks about when you get ready to start making calls, telemarketing calls, which is what our calls are. You have to make sure you scrub your numbers through the DNC and work through that. So we'll send that out to you and it'll explain to you, here's the process, here's how it works, here's how that is. And then when you have questions on it, after you get the documents, and everything, just give Denton a call and we'll be good.
I'm on that DNC myself.
And you know what, let me ask you,
And if you get a complaint, just say I was really calling to extend your vehicle warranty.
okay, so right now, who do you use for showings? But effective January 1st, Broker Bay. Yeah. Is a new one. Now, it's not a replacement of, it's a new one. I've got to go ahead and sign up for it because you're a participant with all the Metro stuff. So you can register. They've got a webinar, I think this afternoon. Is Joe here? Oh, Joe Forrest. So 1 o'clock, so you can sign up for it. Here's the key with Broker Bay. It's supposed to be really be good. The best thing about it, it's not owned by Google, by Zillow. That's good. It's supposed to be synced with our super and all those kinds of things. But the cost for Broker Bay will be included in your MLS dues, whether you use it or not. Right now, showing time is in your office bill, and you can choose to do it or not do it. But Broker Bay, there will be no choice. It's automatic, it's there, and you'll be charged for it within your MLS dues. Pardon?
I was saying what you were saying.
Yeah, Broker BAY. Broker Bay. It starts effect, well, it actually, this week, it becomes available, becomes really effective January 1st.
Are you saying, Broker Bay will be in replacement of?
No, not a replacement. You can still do showing time.
But it's an addition to.
Well, here's what you need to know. We have multiple showing services out there right now. Not just showing time. But we'll still have showing time. You'll have whatever else here. The key is Broker Bay will also be there. The key is you're going to pay for it, whether you use it or not. You're paying for it. It's going to be in your MLS dues. So it'll be there. Yes, ma'am.
But you're saying that we choose to use that one over Showtime, then we can.
You can cancel Showtime.
Yeah.
Not using it. But she said, well, why should I pay for that when I get it over here, including my dues? And you have to pay for it. John, did you have something?
I'd just like to add that one thing that Broker Bay is going to be, it is owned by Supra and it will integrate with the Supra boxes. So I think we're going to have some advantages there. We know when the box is going to be open, when it's been closed and all that kind of good stuff. I think
it'll be an improvement
system, but it's going to have.
Still a work in progress.
It's still a work in progress. It's got some worms, so be careful.
What? Well, whatever. Okay. Any other quick questions?
Yeah,
Yes, ma'am.
you guys, New Jersey, you guys need to take this show on the road.
Yeah.
You guys are
Vegas
really
next
good
stop.
together.
Vegas next stop. Guys, thank you very much. Correct question or anything?
I have some cards up here and I'll stick around for a few questions if people have.
Our meeting is adjourned. You're fine.
You know what, it's. My name is Trouble Neighbor.